My mom forced me to give up my room for my cousin, saying she needed it more. I moved in with my dad and cut contact. That was 3 months ago. Today, she's begging me to come back home. Look, I never thought I'd be writing one of these posts, but here we are. 3 months ago, my whole world got flipped upside down over something that sounds totally ridiculous when I say it out loud: my bedroom. Yeah, you heard that right. A freaking bedroom caused my entire family to implode like a house of cards. So here's the deal. I'm 17, been living with my mom since my parents split when I was 12. My dad moved about 30 minutes away to this decent apartment complex, and honestly, our relationship got way better after the divorce. No more screaming matches at dinner, no more walking on eggshells, just quality time when I'd visit every other weekend. My room at mom's place was my sanctuary, you know? I'd spent years making it perfect, had my Xbox set up just right, posters of my favorite bands covering every inch of the walls, string lights that gave off this cozy vibe. My desk, where I'd grind through homework while blasting music through my AirPods. It wasn't huge or anything fancy, but it was mine. Every corner held memories, from the tiny scuff mark on the wall where I'd accidentally thrown my controller during a particularly brutal Call of Duty match, to the collection of concert tickets taped above my headboard. Then my cousin shows up. Sarah's always been the golden child of our extended family. 2 years older than me, headed to some prestigious college in the fall, the whole 9 yards. Her parents got divorced too, but apparently their split was way messier than my folks. Her mom, my aunt, decided to move across the country for work and couldn't take Sarah with her right away due to some legal stuff I never fully understood. So naturally, my mom volunteers our place as a temporary solution. At first, I figured it wouldn't be too bad. Sarah seemed cool enough, and mom set up the guest room for her. It's smaller than my room, sure, but it's got everything you need: bed, dresser, even a little desk by the window. I thought we'd coexist just fine for however long this arrangement lasted. Boy, was I wrong. Update. Hey everyone, thanks for all the support so far. I'm still processing everything that happened, but reading your comments helps. Quick question though, am I crazy for thinking what came next was completely out of line? Within a week, Sarah started complaining. The guest room was too small. The bed was uncomfortable. She couldn't focus on her college prep because the room didn't have good lighting. She needed more space for all her stuff. Basically, she made it sound like mom was housing her in some kind of dungeon instead of a perfectly decent bedroom. And mom? She ate it up. Every complaint, every dramatic sigh, every comment about how hard this transition was for poor Sarah. I watched my mom transform into this completely different person, bending over backwards to make my cousin comfortable while I'm sitting there like, hello, I live here too. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. I'm in my room finishing up a history project that's due the next day, music playing softly while I typed away on my laptop. It's around 9 p.m. and I hear voices getting louder downstairs. Not arguing exactly, but that kind of intense conversation. That makes you pause whatever you're doing to listen. I creep to the top of the stairs and catch fragments of what they're saying. Sarah's going on about how she can't properly prepare for college in such a cramped space, how she needs room to spread out her books and materials. Then I hear mom's voice and my stomach drops. She's actually considering it. She's actually talking about moving Sarah into my room. I practically sprint down those stairs, no longer caring about being sneaky. Both of them look up as I burst into the living room, and I can tell from mom's expression that I heard exactly what I thought I heard. The conversation that followed still makes my blood boil when I think about it. Mom tried to frame it like she was asking for my input, but it was clear she'd already made up her mind. Sarah needed the bigger room more than I did. Sarah was going through a difficult time and needed extra support. Sarah was preparing for college and required adequate space to study. What about me? What about the fact that I'd lived in that room for 5 years? What about my stuff, my setup, my space? Mom's response was basically that I should be more understanding and mature about the situation. That family helps family, and sometimes that means making sacrifices. That I was being selfish for not wanting to help my cousin during her time of need. The worst part? Sarah just sat there nodding along like she genuinely believed she deserved my room more than I did. Not a hint of guilt or acknowledgement that this was a huge ask. Just this entitled attitude like, of course she should. Get the better room? Why was that even a question? I tried reasoning with mom, offered compromises. Maybe Sarah and I could switch rooms temporarily, just until she got settled. Maybe we could rearrange some furniture to make the guest room more functional. Maybe we could set up a study area in the living room or dining room. None of it mattered. Mom had decided, and that was that. The move happened that weekend. I watched helplessly as my sanctuary got dismantled piece by piece. Sarah didn't even offer to help, just supervised from the doorway while mom and I hauled my stuff into the cramped guest room. My carefully arranged posters got rolled up and shoved in a closet because there wasn't enough wall space. My gaming setup got crammed into a corner where the lighting was terrible. Years of making that space my own, erased in a single afternoon. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed surrounded by boxes I hadn't had time to unpack, something inside me just broke. Not dramatically or anything. More like a quiet snap, like a rubber band that's been stretched too far. I realized that in my own home, I'd become a guest while the actual guest had taken over my life. Update. The response to this post has been incredible, and honestly, it's helping me feel less crazy about everything. Someone asked if I tried talking to my dad about what was happening. The answer is yes, and that conversation changed everything. I called Dad the next morning before school, tried to keep it casual at first, just asking how he was doing, if we were still on for our usual weekend visit. But he knows me too well, could tell something was wrong from the tone of my voice. So I told him everything. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. When Dad finally spoke, his voice had this edge to it that I rarely hear. He asked me to repeat some of the details, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then he said something that I'll never forget. "Sweetheart, you don't have to live like that. You always have a place here." That conversation planted a seed that grew throughout the week. Every morning I'd wake up in that tiny room surrounded by boxes, listening to Sarah laughing with Mom over breakfast like they were best friends. Every afternoon I'd come home from school to find them planning some activity or shopping trip, while I felt like an intruder in my own house. Every evening I'd retreat to my cramped space and think about Dad's words. The final straw came exactly 1 week after the room switch. I was trying to do homework at the tiny desk that barely fit in the guest room, my laptop balanced precariously next to a stack of textbooks. The lighting was awful, and I kept having to squint to read my notes. Meanwhile, I could hear Sarah in my room, video chatting with friends about her college plans, laughing and carrying on like she owned the place. That's when it hit me. She basically did own the place now. She'd walked into our home and within 2 weeks had claimed the best room, become Mom's new favorite, and turned me into a second-class citizen in the house I'd called home for 5 years. And the worst part? Everyone was acting like this was perfectly normal and reasonable. I packed that night. Not everything, because I didn't want to tip off Mom about what I was planning. Just essentials, clothes, toiletries, my laptop, a few items that meant the most to me. I left a note on the kitchen counter explaining that I was going to stay with Dad for a while, that I needed some space to think. Dad picked me up at 6 a.m. before anyone else was awake. He didn't ask questions during the drive, just kept glancing at me with this concerned expression. When we got to his apartment, he made pancakes, my favorite breakfast, and we sat at his little kitchen table while I told him the whole story from beginning to end. His reaction was everything I needed to hear. He was angry, not at me but at the situation. He couldn't believe Mom had prioritized a temporary guest over her own daughter's comfort and stability. He assured me that his place was my home too, that I could stay as long as I needed, that we'd figure out the legal stuff if it came to that. That first day at Dad's felt like stepping out of a fog I hadn't realized I was walking through. His apartment isn't huge, but he immediately started talking about how we could rearrange his spare room to make it more comfortable for me. He asked what I needed, what would make me feel at home, how he could help make this transition easier. The contrast was stark. At Mom's house, I'd been asked to sacrifice and compromise and be understanding. At Dad's place, I was being asked what I needed to be happy and comfortable. After weeks of feeling invisible and unimportant, suddenly I mattered again. School was weird that first week. I'd changed my emergency contact information to Dad's number, but I hadn't told any of my friends about the living situation change. When people asked why I seemed different or distracted, I just said I was dealing with some family stuff. The truth felt too complicated to explain, and honestly, I was still processing it myself. Mom started calling after the second day. First, just checking in, making sure I was okay, asking when I was coming home. When I told her I wasn't sure, that I needed more time, her tone shifted. She started getting defensive about the room situation, insisting that she'd been trying to help family and that I was being unreasonable. Those phone calls got progressively more heated over the following weeks. Mom oscillated between guilt trips and anger, sometimes within the same conversation. She'd tell me how hurt she was that I'd left without discussing it with her, then in the next breath defend her decision to give Sarah my room. She'd say she missed me and wanted me to come home, then criticize me for being selfish and ungrateful. The breaking point in our phone conversations came about a month after I'd moved in with Dad. Mom called during dinner, and I could tell from her voice that she'd been crying. She launched into this speech about how Sarah was having a hard time adjusting, how the family was falling apart, how I was making everything worse by being stubborn. That's when I finally lost it. I told her that I'd tried being understanding, that I'd offered compromises, that I'd done everything I could to make the situation work. But at the end of the day, she'd chosen Sarah over me, and I wasn't going to stick around to be treated like a second-class citizen in my own home. The call ended with both of us hanging up angry, and we didn't speak for almost a month after that. Update. A lot of you have been asking about what happened next with my mom and cousin. Well, the drama definitely didn't end there, and honestly, the next part still feels surreal. During that month of silence, Dad and I fell into a really good routine. He helped me transfer some of my classes to online versions so I could maintain my grades while adjusting to the new living situation. We went furniture shopping and picked out a desk and dresser for my new room. He even let me paint one wall this deep blue color I'd always wanted to try. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my space and my life. Meanwhile, I started hearing things through the family grapevine. My cousin Sarah apparently wasn't adjusting as well as everyone had hoped. According to my aunt, who called Dad occasionally with updates, Sarah was struggling with the isolation of being away from her friends and her familiar environment. The college prep that had been so important wasn't going as smoothly as expected. More interesting was what I heard about Mom. My grandparents, who live across town, mentioned that she seemed stressed and kept asking if they'd heard from me. She'd apparently confided in my grandmother that she was worried she'd made a mistake, but she was too proud to admit it directly. I felt conflicted hearing all this. Part of me felt vindicated, like maybe the people who'd insisted I was being unreasonable were starting to see the situation differently. But another part of me just felt sad. This whole mess had torn apart relationships that used to be solid, and nobody seemed to be happy with how things had turned out. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dad ran into Mom at the grocery store about 6 weeks after I'd moved in with him. According to him, she looked exhausted and asked immediately how I was doing. When he told her I was doing well, getting good grades, and seemed happier than I'd been in months, she started crying right there in the cereal aisle. That conversation led to Mom calling Dad later that evening. They had a long talk, the first real conversation they'd had since the divorce that wasn't about logistics or scheduling. Dad told me later that Mom admitted she'd been so focused on helping Sarah that she'd lost sight of how her decisions were affecting me. She'd assumed I would just adapt and be fine, without really considering what she was asking me to give up. Dad, to his credit, didn't pile on or make her feel worse than she already did. He just listened and shared his perspective on what the past couple of months had been like for me. How I'd seemed defeated and frustrated in those final weeks at her house, and how I'd gradually returned to my normal self after moving in with him. The conversation ended with them agreeing that the current arrangement was working well for me, and that any changes should be based on what I wanted, not what the adults thought was best. Which brings us to last week, when Mom finally called me directly, not to argue or guilt trip, but to apologize. She said she'd been thinking a lot about the whole situation and realized that she'd handled it badly, that she'd been so concerned with helping Sarah that she'd forgotten to consider how her daughter was feeling, that she should have found other solutions instead of asking me to give up my space. The apology felt genuine, but I wasn't ready to just forgive and forget. I told her I appreciated her acknowledging what had happened, but that I was happy where I was and didn't want to rush back into a situation that might not have really changed. She surprised me by saying she understood and respected that decision. That she hoped eventually we could rebuild our relationship, but that it had to happen at my pace, not hers. As for Sarah, she's apparently decided to move in with a friend's family for the remainder of the time before college. Mom mentioned that Sarah had also apologized and said she hadn't realized how big of a deal the room swap had been for me, which honestly felt like too little too late, but whatever. The thing is, I don't hate my mom or anything. I understand that she was trying to help family and thought she was doing the right thing. But the way she went about it, prioritizing someone else's comfort over mine without even really asking how I felt about it, that hurt in a way that's going to take time to heal. Living with Dad has been really good for me. We've gotten closer than we've been since before the divorce, and I've realized that this arrangement might actually be better for everyone long term. I'm doing well in school, I have my own space that I can arrange however I want, and I feel valued and heard in a way I hadn't felt in months. Mom and I are slowly rebuilding our relationship. We text occasionally, and she's invited me to lunch a few times. It's awkward still, but it's progress. She's made it clear that if I ever want to move back, my room would be available. She's even offered to let me redecorate it however I want. But, honestly, I'm good where I am. Dad and I are talking about making this arrangement permanent, at least until I graduate. We've both discovered that we work well as roommates, and I like the person I am when I'm living here. The whole experience taught me that sometimes standing up for yourself means making hard choices that disappoint people you care about. It taught me that my needs and feelings matter, even when someone else's situation seems more dramatic or urgent. And it taught me that sometimes the best thing you can do for a relationship is to step away from it until you can engage from a position of strength rather than resentment. 3 months ago, I felt like I was drowning in my own home, invisible and unimportant. Today, I'm writing this from my desk in my room at Dad's place, string lights twinkling overhead, my gaming setup exactly how I like it, feeling more confident and secure than I have in years. Sometimes the best way to save a family relationship is to be brave enough to change it entirely. And sometimes the people who truly love you will respect your choices, even when those choices are hard for them to accept. As for my cousin Sarah, I heard through the family network that she's doing better now too. Turns out what she really needed wasn't a bigger room, but a living situation where she felt like she truly belonged instead of like an unwelcome guest. We're all better off with arrangements that actually work for everyone involved. Mom keeps saying she hopes I'll come back someday, and maybe I will. But if I do, it'll be because I want to, not because I feel obligated to. And that difference, small as it might seem, changes everything.